Well, I had to save the best for last. There was a lot of really unique and a lot of music that was released at the end of May, and this was one of those where I kept putting off the review because I wanted to listen to it more. And whenever I put out a review, I'm always like, okay, I better start preparing for the next one. And I didn't want to let this one go, so let's dive into it. Holocene by The Ocean. So The Ocean, or The Ocean Collective, is a German progressive metal band getting their start in the early 2000s and being extremely prolific. Like, Holocene is the 9th studio album from them. It follows up the 1-2 punch of Phanerosonic 1 and 2, and that was my introduction to this band. And I really loved how these boys, with pretty much all of their albums, really tackle Earth's distant past, going deep into that geological formation, deep into the ground kind of thing, and looking at the prehistoric aspects of it. The last handful of albums were the beginning stages of life, and now with Holocene, we've actually caught up to the modern age. Now, I know in the scientific community, there's a little bit of a debate whether or not we're still in the Holocene or if we've actually moved beyond it, but who knows? Who knows? So I was looking forward to this, even though Phanerosonic 2 didn't hit me as hard as the first one. I was still excited, and I was still excited to see what these boys did because they blend my two favorite features of really intense progressive metal, which is the melodies, the harmonies, this mellow aspect, to very aggressive, very bombastic, very blast beats, and aggressive styles of music. I could tell right off the get-go that we were in for something special. I can hear there's a massive change up of sounds. We're a little bit more electronic in this one. We're leaning a little bit more onto creating atmosphere and vibes rather than just blasting down the doors with the blast beats. And I'm here for that. I'm getting flavors of what Death Heaven was doing last year or the year before with Infinite Granite, and what the Mars Volta was doing last year with their self-titled kind of return album, where, it wasn't trying to lay down those really aggressive, really intense, really chaotic and bombastic moments, but taking their time to create very atmospheric, very intense and personal tracks. And I feel like, much like those other albums, for me it works. For me it absolutely works. I can tell that it doesn't work for a lot of other people, and I can understand and empathize with that. But man, for me, this just gave me a big old warm hug. Like right off the get-go with the first opening track of Pre-Boreal, I love how it opens up. There's a lot more synths found on here. It's the perfect kind of like opening up the curtains. It takes its time to develop, and by the time we get to the midpoint of this track into the latter half of it, it's really opening itself up. We've got that blast of the drums that's creating and overlaying this overlay of synthesizers and atmosphere on there, so that when we get into the second track of Boreal, and right off the get-go, right when we get to Boreal, like, again, it takes its time to get going, and when it does, there's a big explosion of sound. It's reminding me of some of the things that like what a lot of Brit pop and Brit rockers were doing, like Radiohead and Muse with Absolution and Black Holes and Revelations, or Kid A and OK Computer, where there's this like essence about it. There's this menacing drawl that's kind of permeating everything, with this darkness that's, there's something waiting in the wings of this menacing synthesizer that's going on. But then when everything's kind of realized and we get into the climax of this track, man, it opens up into something really, really beautiful, even though it's really heavy. And I guess the same could be said about the Sea of Reeds, and I'm also getting flavors of latter Leprous tracks, anything from Melinda or Pitfalls or Aphelion. It's kind of got that kind of essence about it, the very kind of leaning more onto the singer-songwriter. And it isn't until we get to Atlantic where there's this kind of shift off. The first three tracks really do take their times to get going. There's a little bit of a crescendo near the ending of each of these tracks. And even for that, I'm really getting into it. I'm really loving how each one is lulling me. It's kind of hypnotizing me. It's taking its time to really lay down the atmosphere and lay down the feels on here. And so by the time we get to Atlantic, which is almost into the 9-minute mark, it's done taking its time in the individual tracks and starting to really open itself up and blossom. And I can see a lot of the Ocean's fan bases being kind of like frustrated because we've gotten through, what is it, like about 15 to 20 minutes worth of music, and we haven't even had that really bombastic, really intense, really aggressive style that they're really known for. But I'm okay with having to wait, almost until the halfway moment for it to really unleash, because since they've been so subdued and held back, when they're finally able to let loose, it's like that tightening of the coil that's finally able to release. So when that aggression finally does come, when that explosion of sound finally hits, it hits so much harder because we have been kind of primed for a softer sound. So when that hit comes, it hits a lot more, and it's so much more fulfilling when we get to Atlantic. So then we come into the second half of the album that starts off with Subboreal, and I love how deep and menacing this track sounds. We're kind of taking a breather after the big explosion of the ending of Atlantic happened. We're able to kind of lick our wounds, so to speak, and I like how even this track still has its hooks in you. We come to Unconformities, which is probably my favorite track off of this whole album, very clearly because it's the 9-minute one. This is reminding me of like the Flood from Congregation from Leprous, where it's really rooted in a very minimalistic chord progression. There's only a few notes that get circled around, and I really appreciate the woman singing on this one. She leads the main song for quite a while before we get into the big explosion. Like, this is a great setup and payoff track, because I'm feeling a lot of the more subdued tracks from Kid A or from Absolution, from Muse, where it's really taking its time to build itself up. And when they're saying don't turn on the bright lights, and it slowly starts to build and slowly starts to build to the point where it just unleashes itself, very similar to how Atlantic did, but this one doesn't hold back any of its punches. It goes straight for the jugular, and I love how bombastic and how intense it is. Even with this, coming into the last two tracks of Parabiosis and the Subatlantic, once again, we have that really strong foundation of this track starting us all off. It's much more subdued, it slowly builds itself up, but man, once it hits, it's so hard, and I'm loving how this track kind of concludes and ties everything off so that when we get to Subatlantic, we're ready just for a closing of the curtain, leaving the theater, and having that really sweet flavor in our mouths. And it is funny that they kind of kept the hardest, most succinct, and most tight track for the very end, because Subatlantic hits you so friggin' hard. It's kind of taking where Atlantic, the fourth track, stopped and then just continued on with a massive punch. It's the heaviest, hardest track off the album, and it ends on a huge high note. So yeah, in the end, I think the Ocean hit a home run with this one. This is so far my favorite record from them, and I have not been able to stop listening to it. I can tell certain fans of the Ocean would be frustrated with this album. I can see some people say, it's just another album from the Ocean. It doesn't really cover any new ground. It's the most subdued or the most boring. Not a whole lot happens. But for me, I really enjoy their more somber approach to this one. It works so much better than what a lot of other bands have attempted when they've attempted this kind of style, because they never sacrifice the brutality. They've only kind of pumped the brakes on it to make it land so much harder, because when it hits harder than I think they've done in the past 3 or 4 albums from them, if I'm being perfectly honest. I absolutely love this album. This is a Run Don't Walk, and my final rating for this one is Holocene by the Ocean is one I would absolutely pick up in physical format. This is an absolutely Run Don't Walk. This gets the note seal of approval. I think they really hammered it home. This is going to be an album that I'm going to be listening to pretty heavily throughout the year, and I would be shocked to see if it doesn't make it on my top 10 of the end of the year. So yeah, that's what I've got for Holocene. I have a feeling I'm kind of in the minority within this one, I feel like I'm in that same camp that I was in with Infinite Granite from Deaf Heaven. Like Fear Inoculum from Tool is another huge one. And Mars Volta, self-titled. I enjoy and love this style of music, but I also know that I'm not necessarily the majority when it comes to the metal music. So I know that, I recognize that, and I accept that. But what do you guys think about this record? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. Let me know how you think it stacks up to the rest of their discography. I'd like to know that. And yeah, I think that's all I've got for Holocene from the Ocean. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.